Hi, my name is April Mann, and I am talking about a book that we were asked to read. We were given a book selection, taking a course at Mary Baldwin University, and the course that I'm taking is Meaning and Purpose, the Foundations of Education. So we had a book a title choice that we could choose, and I chose School, the Story of Public Education. I chose this title because I wanted to understand the history of how public schools started. I wanted to understand the role and purpose of why our children are given a 13-year contract to be educated. So curious as to who decided that and why 13 years was the golden number. And quite frankly, it was the only one from the book selection that was available at the local library that I attend. And the book is structured, it's broken up into 4 sections or themes. The first section of the book is in the time era 1770 to 1900. It talks about the first school, the common school. Part 2 talks about, it's called As American as Public School. It's in the time era 1900 to 1950 when all of school reforms are taking place. Part 3 talks about the separate and unequal doctrine. 1950 to 1980, there are still lots of school reform, and a lot of landmark cases are discussed in this chapter. The last section of the book is titled The Bottom Line, and this Part 4 section is from the time era 1980 to 2000, and the bottom line basically talks about the different reforms that did and didn't work, and that our public education system is still under lots of reform as of today. Lots of controversy, lots of things going on in the school system trying to figure out what works for everyone. About the authors, there are many authors in this book, and this book it took about 10 years to write this book. There are many scholars, many educators who have a lot of credentials. There's even a famous person, Meryl Streep, who does the foreword to this book, and who doesn't love Meryl Streep, loved her take on education and how important teachers are. The 2 teachers, her music teacher had such a huge impact in her life, and she talks about the fundamentals of public education and how important it is to have role models, to have teachers that make such an impact in their lives. So it was neat seeing her take on that. But there are many authors: Sarah Mondale, James Anderson, Larry Cuban, Carl Castle, Diane Ravitch, David Tayek. These are professors at universities. The 3 main points of the book we were to discuss as part of our presentation. One of the main points that I took from this book is the importance of the institution of public education that it has on America and the impact it has on our economy. Thomas Jefferson kind of started this whole school business, so to speak. He basically believed that in order for Americans to survive, for our democracy to survive as we know it, Americans needed to be educated. So Jefferson fought long and hard. In 1778, he proposed. He gave a proposal that guaranteed 3 years of public schooling for all children, and the bill went through many times. Between the era of 1779 through 1817, he fought hard and long to pass this bill to educate our children. It got turned down many times in this time frame. I guess it's like a 40-year time frame. It finally passed in the 1830s. He didn't give up. It was his dream, a statewide school system to be formed. So finally it became a reality. It took root. It first took root in Massachusetts, where there was a school reformer, and at the time, the Secretary of Education, Horace Mann, started our first common school. In 1900, public school was one of the most treasured public institutions, creating a common school system with a common moral and political agenda for all citizens. Americans celebrated tax-supported free schools and the nation's democratic promise that all boys and girls could improve themselves and make a mark in the world with their talents and efforts in education. The second main point of this book, immigration has changed America. It continues to do so with the challenges. It challenges our democracy and the way schools are run. Based on a common set of political and social values, schools then and now continue to shape America's national identity. When schools first started back in the 18th century during the colonial era, parents had to pool their money to pay for children to go. During this time, those enrolled only attended 6 to 12 weeks out of the entire year. That was basically, it was an agricultural economy back then. Everybody worked, even the children, the adults, they all worked on farms and plantations. So the few that did get to go to school, it was based on wealth, race, and gender. Some more main points. The immigration swelled. It brought large numbers of Roman Catholics to a predominantly Protestant nation. During this time in the 1840s, it was the Industrial Revolution. So the states, the northeastern states, they created more and more public schools to basically honor the influx of the immigrants. During this Revolutionary War time, private schools started on the basis that Catholics felt that they should be able to practice their own religious beliefs. In the early 1900s, immigrants saw education as the ticket to the best America had to offer. They were attracted to the system of government and how it ran. Decisions were made by state officials rather than elected officials. Class, gender, and race prejudices existed in society and continued to shape the classrooms. IQ tests were even given as a means of determining the types of schools you would go to. I didn't realize that. That kind of blew my mind. The third main point that this book introduces is the introduction of reform in the school system and the ongoing battle to improve the institution's infrastructure and fight against discrimination. There's lots of landmark cases in our history that were fought and won during this time. One of them, in 1954, Joseph A. Delaney filed a lawsuit in a case known as Brown v. Board of Education, which made history in the fight against racial discrimination and overturned segregation. He had sued because white school officials would not provide school buses for his children. Local white authorities in Clarendon County, South Carolina, fired him from a schoolhouse that he taught in for 10 years. His wife was fired. His two sisters and his niece were fired. They burned down his house. They stoned his church, later burning it down, and ran him out of the state. That blows my mind, reading some of these stories, that people were treated so cruelly, that these types of things actually happened. 1974 was another landmark piece of legislation that passed. Dorothy Raffel wanted to play basketball. They only had boys' teams, sports teams, during this era. And they didn't have a girls' basketball team, but she wanted to play on the boys' team. So what happened? Her story is one of many which charged the federal government of violating Title IX, which prohibited the rewarding of federal grants to programs that discriminated on the basis of gender. The result was a girls' team was formed at her school. It was hardly comparable. It was actually kind of a joke because it was basically an open gym time where the gym teacher allowed the girls to play basketball. They still at this point weren't allowed to play with the boys' team. But it was a good start. She later went on to receive an athletic scholarship to college, one of the first granted to women. By the early 1990s, 40% of all high school athletes were girls, up from 1% in 1970. I knew that education has always been diverse by race, as America has always been a melting pot of immigrants. Working as an instructional assistant in an elementary school, I feel that students accept one another, even though there's still such a huge diversity of gender and race in the classroom. I don't feel any type of tension or hostility amongst the students because of their race. Of course, students don't get along all the time, but I would never pinpoint any of the problems that I've seen in the classroom because of their race. I feel like our administration does a really good job of fighting for equality. I feel like everybody is treated equally in our school system, in the elementary school at least that I'm working at, that I attend. In defense of the ongoing battle to make the classroom a place of equality for all, I think America has come a long way, and continues to fight the battle in the right direction, and it's something we should be proud of. News to me, my memory, I guess perhaps my memory doesn't serve me that well, but I just don't remember all of these stories growing up and learning about our history, where so many parents and politicians fought so hard against integration. It blows my mind. At the time the law was passed to end segregation, I was not aware that the governor of Virginia, Lindsay Almond, she stated that Virginia would not enforce integration, totally against it. There were so many, the South fought hard to defy this ruling. So even though all these laws passed, all this reform took place so that, we could integrate all races, segregation ended. It was years before everybody was on board. It was fought against. People, one thing I never ever realized that I read in this book was that people literally risked their lives to fight for their rights. For instance, in 1957, 9 black teenagers were chosen to integrate into Little Rock Central High School. One of these students, Melba Patillo Beals, she escaped hanging rope of a lynch mob. She had burning acid sprayed in her eyes and dodged lighted sticks of dynamite being thrown at her. These teenagers were not welcome in the school, yet they still walked into that school every day, being tortured, basically. But they stood up for their rights. President Dwight Eisenhower, during this time, he called in the 101st Airborne Division, which was known as the Elite Screaming Eagles, to defend opening the doors to these students. What an example of bravery and courage in our history. I never consider that the fact that what America stands for can be found in the principles and values of how we run our public education system. I've always known how important it's one of the top priorities, educating our children, educating ourselves. But I never realized the impact that our school system had on our democracy and how it makes America who we are. My biggest takeaway, I think, from reading this book is that the history of our education and the power it has in our society is so complex. The notion that white supremacy is so deep-rooted and ingrained in our history is a big part of our education system. It is part of our heritage. We will continue as a society to fight against it. We face a lot of challenges that come with, having such a diverse group of people living together. But this is an ongoing battle, and I think, one of my favorite parts of the book is the ongoing theme of hope that the American people, we all still stand for. We still stand for democracy, where all people are equal. We're created equal. We should be treated equal, and I think that we continue to fight to aspire to this belief through the continuation of reforming the quality and excellence of our schools. I feel a little bit sheltered from this ideology when I'm speaking of the white supremacy and just how it was just such a big part of our heritage and how the school system got started. And I feel a little bit sheltered because, as being born as a Generation Xer, I didn't feel the hostility, a racial climate of hostility when I was in school in the 1970s. I had many close friends who were African American. My mom's best friend was immigrant from China, and she was always welcomed into our home. So I never looked at people because of their color. To me, I guess I was just I'm thankful in a lot of ways. And I'm as I'm older now, I'm learning more about it. I feel like there's more an awareness of our racial climate in the school system now, as I believe in our society and with our media, we're bringing more attention to it as we continue to try and reform the schools. Should it stay or should it go? When I was first saw this title, I flipped through its pages. My first thought was, it will bore me to tears. It's dry, it's dates, it's facts, it's history. Sometimes that can be a little bit dull. However, I learned so much about the history of education that I'm a better, more educated person because of it, because of its content. And it was the testimonies, the stories, just were amazing to me. So many things that I just did not realize were a part of our history. So yes, this is a great book choice for any class teaching about the foundations of education. The realization is that we all have a common bond. We're all citizens who live in America, and we're all the same. Regardless of our gender, our race, our status, we're all fighting for the same thing, to improve our educational system and how we treat one another. It's a huge part in what defines us all as individuals, and that's what I really took from this book. This book has shaped how I feel about the profession of teaching. I will certainly be more aware of the sensitivity we should all have towards one another's cultural backgrounds. I will take the time to get to know all of my students in my classrooms, and I will embrace our differences with an awareness that those differences are part of who we are. Students will respect diversity. They will feel safe to share their culture and their beliefs in the classroom. They'll feel safe to share their cultures. Although I'm motivated by the legacy of the Reagan era, as this former president fought to improve education, pushing for higher academic standards, I do not agree that standardized testing is the answer to fulfilling our students' greatest potentials. I think in some ways where we've gone with trying to improve the excellence and quality of the content that we're teaching our students has in some ways stunned our students with all of the testings, the SOLs. But that's a whole nother story in itself. So this is my take on the book, and I will end with saying thank you for listening.